He locked me up for another woman, and I dreamed he would save her in an accident, letting me die. Chapter 1: The Perfect Lie. They all said Dominic loved me. For years, I believed it too. Our marriage wasn't the kind filled with passion or whispered, "I love yous" in the dark. But it was built on something I thought was enough: mutual respect. At least, that's what I told myself. Until the day my perfect lie shattered. It was a cold autumn evening when I found out. The rain drizzled outside, matching the storm raging inside my heart. Dominic had been working late again. I was used to it by now. The late nights, the unanswered calls, the vague excuses. But that night, I decided to visit his office. His assistant hesitated when she saw me at the door, her usual polite smile faltering. "Mrs. Sinclair, Mr. Sinclair is." "I'll wait," I interrupted, brushing past her before she could stop me. I knew Dominic's schedule. At this hour, he should have been reviewing contracts or stuck in some video conference. But when I reached his private office, the scene before me told a different story. Dominic wasn't alone. A woman sat on the couch, her delicate fingers resting lightly on his arm. Her soft voice filled the air, her laughter tinkling like wind chimes. And Dominic, my husband, the man who barely spared me a glance when he came home at night, was looking at her with warmth I had never seen in his eyes before. Something inside me cracked. "Dominic." My voice trembled, but I forced myself to stand tall. His head snapped up. For a split second, I saw a panic flicker in his gaze before his usual cold mask settled over his features. "Why are you here?" I took a step forward, my heart hammering. "Who is she?" The woman turned toward me then, her expression one of practiced innocence. But there was something else in her eyes, something victorious. "Susan Carter," she introduced herself smoothly, standing up and extending a hand as if we were strangers at a business meeting. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sinclair." I stared at her outstretched hand, then back at Dominic. He didn't speak. He didn't move. I suddenly felt like an outsider in my own marriage. Then it hit me. The name. Susan Carter. It wasn't just any name. She was the Susan Carter, Dominic's first love, the woman he had never been able to forget. My chest tightened. "How long?" My voice barely came out, but I knew he heard me. Dominic sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." A bitter laugh bubbled up inside me. "Not what I think? Then tell me, Dominic. What exactly is this?" Silence. That was all the confirmation I needed. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had been so blind. So stupid. And then, as if this night couldn't get worse, Susan tilted her head and smiled. So sweet, so soft. "He's only been taking care of me. We have history after all." Taking care of her. And what was I? His wife? Or just a convenient replacement? I turned to Dominic, my heart aching. "And me? What am I to you?" For the first time, he looked guilty. "Elena." But I didn't wait to hear his excuse. I turned on my heel and walked away, even as my vision blurred. That night, I made a promise to myself. If I was nothing but a substitute in his life, then I would make sure to leave before he could discard me like one. And I would never look back. Chapter 2: A Cage for His Wife. Dominic came home late that night, just like he always did. The only difference was that this time, I knew why. I sat in the dimly lit living room, my hands clenched into fists on my lap. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching my patience thinner. When the front door finally clicked open, he walked in, loosening his tie with that same nonchalant expression he always wore. As if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't caught him with her. As if my heart wasn't breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Where were you?" My voice was eerily calm, but the fire inside me burned hotter than ever. Dominic glanced at me, seemingly unfazed. "Work." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Work?" I stood up, my eyes locking onto his. "Was that what you were doing with Susan Carter tonight?" His movement stilled. For a second, something flickered in his gaze, annoyance, maybe even guilt, but it disappeared just as quickly. He sighed and tossed his tie onto the couch, rolling up his sleeves as if he were preparing for an exhausting conversation. Elena, don't start. Don't start. My voice cracked. Are you serious, Dominic? I saw you with her. I heard her say you were taking care of her. What am I to you? A burden? A mistake? A substitute? His jaw tightened. It's not like that. Then tell me what it is. I stepped forward, my nails digging into my palms. Tell me why my husband looks at another woman like she's his entire world while I'm nothing more than... My voice broke before I could finish. Dominic pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling sharply. You're overreacting. Overreacting. The word sent a sharp pain through my chest. Overreacting. I let out a hollow laugh. I gave up everything for this marriage. I stayed by your side, waiting, hoping that one day you'd look at me the way you look at her. And all this time you've been... I swallowed hard. You've been lying to me, haven't you? He didn't answer. That silence hurt more than any cruel words he could have said. Dominic. My voice softened, my hands trembling at my sides. Just tell me the truth. Do you love her? His eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw hesitation. But then his expression turned cold. She's important to me, not you. Not his wife. Not the woman who had stood by him through everything. Something inside me shattered beyond repair. I took a shaky step back. So what does that make me? He didn't answer. Again. The silence was deafening. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. If I was nothing to him, then I wouldn't waste another moment begging for a place in his heart. I want a divorce. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Dominic's head snapped up. Elena. His tone was sharp, filled with something unreadable. You don't mean that. I let out a bitter laugh. I do. I should have said it a long time ago. His expression darkened. No. No. My breath hitched. Are you seriously saying no to a divorce after everything? He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over me. This isn't about you and me. My stomach twisted. Then what is it about? His gaze was unwavering. Susan. I stiffened. You confronting me like this, it could ruin her reputation, he continued. You're my wife, Elena. People will talk if they think He stopped, exhaling sharply. I won't let you make a scene over nothing. Nothing. I choked on a sob. You care more about protecting her than me? He didn't deny it. Instead, he simply looked at me, as if waiting for me to understand his reasoning, as if expecting me to accept it. Something inside me snapped. I hate you, I whispered. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Shock? Regret? But it was gone in an instant. Elena, I won't allow this. Allow? Before I could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Take her to the guest house, he instructed coldly. My blood ran cold. What are you? The door burst open. Two of his bodyguards stepped inside, their faces unreadable. Fear crept up my spine. Dominic, I gasped. You wouldn't. But he only looked at me with that same indifferent expression. It's for the best. Panic surged through me as the guards grabbed my arms. I thrashed, screamed, but Dominic didn't flinch. As they dragged me toward the door, I saw him turn away, already moving on, as if locking me away was nothing more than another business decision. As if I had never mattered. As if I were nothing but a substitute. And for the first time, I realized I was never going to win against Susan Carter. Chapter 3. Left to Die. The day started like any other, but I should have known something was off. I was still locked away in the guest house, confined like a criminal while my husband played the devoted protector to another woman. The loneliness was suffocating, but my heart had already gone numb. Then she came. Susan Carter. She stood in the doorway, dressed elegantly as always, her expensive perfume filling the air. But this time, there was something else in her eyes, a glint of something sharp, dangerous. You look awful, she said, her lips curling into a smirk as she stepped inside. I stared at her, refusing to let her see how broken I truly was. What do you want? She walked around the room, trailing her fingers over the furniture as if she owned the place. I wanted to see you, of course. After all, you've been causing quite a stir. I clenched my fists. I've done nothing to you. She laughed, the sound light and airy, but her eyes were cold. Oh, but you have. By simply existing, Elena, you are a problem. I felt the weight of her words settle over me. This wasn't just about jealousy. This was something far worse. I had always known Dominic loved her, but I never imagined that his love for her would make her bold enough to come here, to face me with such confidence. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. Tell me, do you really think he'll ever love you? You're nothing but a contract, a duty. If it weren't for the circumstances, you wouldn't even be in his life. Her words cut deep, but I refused to show it. And yet, you're here talking to me. If I meant nothing, why bother? Her smile faltered for just a second. Then she sighed dramatically. I suppose you're right. I should just get rid of you instead. I barely had time to process her words before she lunged. The force of her push sent me stumbling back. My body collided with the edge of the table, pain shooting through my ribs. But before I could react, she grabbed a heavy glass vase from the nightstand and swung it toward me. I dodged, but the edge still caught the side of my head. Stars burst behind my eyes as I fell to the floor. My vision blurred. Warmth trickled down my temple blood. I struggled to get up, but she wasn't done. She grabbed my wrist and yanked me toward the open balcony. The sharp breeze hit my face as she forced me closer to the edge. Fear shot through me. Susan, stop. I gasped, my hands gripping the railing to keep myself from falling. But she was relentless. This would all be so much easier if you were gone, she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. Then she shoved me. I screamed as my body pitched forward, but at the last second, I grabbed onto her wrist, pulling her down with me. We tumbled. The world spun. Then impact. The sound of metal screeching. The sharp sting of shattered glass slicing into my skin. The cold rush of water. I barely had time to process what had happened. We had fallen off the balcony, straight onto the hood of a car before rolling onto the road below. Pain exploded in every part of my body. Everything was a blur. Then voices. Footsteps. Dominic's voice. Elena. For a fleeting moment, hope surged inside me. Maybe, just maybe, he had come for me. Maybe he still cared. I tried to reach for him, but my body was too weak. My fingers trembled, coated in blood. Dominic. But then I saw her. Susan lay just a few feet away, her dress torn, a small scratch on her cheek. She whimpered softly, her eyes fluttering open. And just like that, his choice was made. Dominic rushed past me, straight to her. My breath hitched. He knelt beside her, cradling her in his arms. Susan, are you okay? Stay with me. She gave a weak, pitiful nod. It hurts, she whispered dramatically, though she barely had a scratch. I watched in silent horror as he pressed kisses to her forehead, murmuring reassurances, as if she were his entire world. And then it happened. She looked at me. Her lips curled into a victorious smile. It was small, barely noticeable, but I saw it. And in that moment, I knew. I had lost. Not just to her, but to him. Dominic never once glanced in my direction. He never once checked if I was breathing. If I was alive. I was nothing. I was left there, bleeding broken. Alone. The last thing I remembered before the darkness took me was the sound of his voice, soft and loving. I've got you, Susan. And then nothing. Chapter 4. The Decision to Leave. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in a hospital room. The air smelled of antiseptic and fresh linens, but the ceiling above me was unfamiliar. My entire body ached, each breath sending a sharp pain through my ribs. My right arm was bandaged, and my head throbbed from the wound Susan had given me. But I was alive. And it wasn't because of Dominic. The memory of that night hit me like a tidal wave. The accident, the blood, and the way he rushed to Susan without sparing me a single glance. He left me there. A lump formed in my throat. My fingers clenched the bedsheet as I tried to fight back the wave of emotions crashing over me. Just then the door creaked open. "Elena, you're awake." A deep voice, warm and familiar. I turned my head slightly, wincing at the pain, and met the gaze of the man standing in the doorway. "Daniel." Shock rippled through me. "You?" He walked in, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and anger. "I was there that night. I saw everything. Everything." Shame burned inside me. The last thing I wanted was for anyone to witness how little I meant to my own husband. Daniel pulled up a chair beside me and sat down, his gaze dark. "You almost died, Elena. You were barely breathing when I got to you." His jaw clenched. If I had been just a few minutes later. I swallowed hard. How did you find me?" His hands curled into fists. "After you fell, I ran toward you. But when I got there, I saw Dominic carrying her away. He didn't even look at you." His voice dropped, anger laced in every word. "I called for an ambulance, but I knew you wouldn't make it in time if I waited. So I carried you myself." My breath hitched. He saved me. Not my husband. Not the man I had once loved with all my heart. But Daniel. A man who had no obligation to me. I turned my head away, staring at the ceiling. "Dominic hasn't come to see me, has he?" Silence. That was all the answer I needed. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. I shouldn't have been surprised. Deep down, I already knew the answer. Still, hearing the confirmation shattered the last remaining piece of hope I had held on to. Dominic never came. He never asked about me. He never once checked if I had survived. Because to him, I was already dead. I closed my eyes, swallowing back the pain. "Daniel," I whispered. "Can you help me?" He leaned forward. "Anything." I opened my eyes and met his gaze. "I want to leave." His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't question me. Instead, he nodded. "Good." I exhaled shakily, gripping the sheets tighter. I don't want him to find me. I don't want to be in his shadow anymore. I don't want to be his substitute, his burden, or his obligation. I looked up at Daniel, determination finally taking root inside me. I want to disappear from his life forever. For the first time in years, I felt something stir within me. Freedom. And I would never look back. Chapter 5. Too late for regret. Dominic sat in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring blankly at the golden liquid. The ice had melted, watering down the drink, but he made no move to sip it. His thoughts were elsewhere. On her. On Elena. It had been 2 weeks since she disappeared. 2 weeks since he had last heard her voice. 2 weeks since she walked out of his life. And for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. He had been so sure she would come crawling back. He had convinced himself that she had left as some twisted scheme to get his attention, to make him feel guilty. And so he had ignored her absence. Ignored the growing unease in his chest. Ignored the way the house felt empty without her presence. But then, when he finally tried to find her, she was gone. Not just hiding. Not waiting for him. Completely, utterly gone. He had checked the hospitals, wondering if she had been admitted somewhere he didn't know about. Nothing. He had asked his assistant to track her down, expecting her to be in one of the places she usually went when she was upset. Nothing. He had even gone to Daniel, the man who had always been lurking in the background, watching Elena with eyes far too soft for someone who was just a friend. Daniel had looked him dead in the eye and said, "She doesn't want to be found." That was when the panic set in. That was when he realized. She had truly left him. And not in the way Susan always did, throwing tantrums, expecting to be chased after. No. Elena had left him with finality. A hollow ache spread through his chest as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years thinking of Elena as a replacement, a convenience, an afterthought. But now that she was gone, every corner of his life felt suffocating without her. The way she always left the lights on when she knew he would be home late. The way she made sure his favorite coffee was stocked, even when he never thanked her. The way she always smiled at him, even when her own eyes were filled with sadness. He had taken it all for granted. Taken her for granted. And now she was no longer his. A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he muttered. His assistant entered, placing a file on his desk. "Sir, the private investigator sent this over. It's the final report on Mrs. Carter." Dominic's breath hitched at the name. Mrs. Carter. His wife. He hesitated before opening the file. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. Then he saw it. A photograph. Elena, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders. Beside her stood a man. Daniel. The two of them looked happy. His grip tightened on the paper, his chest constricting. She had moved on. Without him. Dominic's vision blurred as a wave of regret crashed over him. He had spent so long prioritizing a woman who never truly loved him, only to lose the one who did. And the cruelest part? She would never forgive him. He had lost her. Forever. Chapter 6. The Weight of Regret. The city lights blurred before Dominic's weary eyes as he slumped against the bar counter, an empty whiskey glass in his trembling hand. The bartender eyed him warily, but he paid no mind. He was already too far gone, drowning in his misery, in his regret, in the emptiness that swallowed him whole. He had been like this for weeks. Drinking, begging, falling apart. His once polished appearance was now a ghost of the man he used to be. The suits he once wore with confidence were now wrinkled and disheveled. The sharp glint in his eyes had dulled into a vacant stare. He had lost everything. And worst of all, he had deserved it. Elena was gone. Not just gone, she had moved on. She was happy. With him. With Daniel. The very man Dominic had once dismissed as insignificant. A bitter laugh escaped his lips as he ran a hand through his unkempt hair. He had spent so many years believing Elena would always be there, always waiting, always loving him despite the pain he caused her. He had been so damn sure that she would come back. But she never did. Instead, she had chosen the man who had always been there for her, the man who had never taken her love for granted. Daniel. Dominic clenched his fists at the thought. It should have been him. He should have been the one by her side. He should have been the one to make her smile. He should have been the one she married. But no. Elena had married Daniel. And she had done it without a single trace of regret. That was what shattered him the most. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't wavered. She had walked down that aisle with another man and never looked back. And Dominic. He had stood outside the church that day, dressed in a suit, hidden in the shadows. Watching. Unable to tear his eyes away as Elena stood before Daniel, her face glowing with happiness, the kind of happiness he had never been able to give her. The moment she said, "I do," something inside Dominic shattered so completely that he knew he would never be whole again. The love of his life was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. A choked sob escaped his throat as he buried his face in his hands. It was too late. No matter how much he begged, no matter how much he regretted, no matter how many tears he shed, Elena would never be his again, and he would spend the rest of his life drowning in that pain. Forever. Chapter 7. The happiest life he could no longer be a part of. The morning sun bathed the garden in golden light as I sat beneath the wisteria tree, a soft breeze playing with my hair. Laughter rang in the air, pure, untainted, and full of joy. I turned my head to see Daniel chasing our little daughter around the yard, her giggles like music to my ears. "Papa, you can't catch me," she squealed, her tiny legs pumping as she tried to outrun him. Daniel let out a playful groan, feigning exhaustion. "Oh no, she's too fast for me. Elena, help." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're on your own, darling. Watching them together, my heart swelled with warmth. This was the life I had always dreamed of, a life where love was given freely, where I was cherished, where my happiness was real. I had everything now. A husband who adored me, a daughter who brought endless joy into my life, a home filled with warmth and love. But beyond the fence, hidden among the shadows, he stood. Dominic. Watching. Regretting. Drowning in the sorrow of his own making. I could feel his presence even without turning around, but I didn't acknowledge him. He didn't deserve even that. He had spent years thinking I would always be there, always waiting for him. But now he could only watch from a distance. That was his punishment. His torment. His hell. Dominic's perspective. He gripped the iron fence, his knuckles white as he stared at the sight before him. Elena. She was glowing. She was laughing. She was happy. And he wasn't the reason for it. No, someone else had taken his place. Someone else held her close. Someone else kissed her goodnight. Someone else made her smile in ways that he never could. A lump formed in Dominic's throat as he took in the sight of the little girl running through the yard. Her daughter. Elena's daughter. His breath hitched. Was she his? No. She couldn't be. Elena had moved on. She had built a new life without him. And now, Dominic was nothing more than a ghost from her past. He closed his eyes, pain searing through his chest. He had once been the man who could command an entire room with a single look. Now, he was just a broken shell, watching from the sidelines as the love of his life flourished without him. He wanted to call out to her, to beg, to fall to his knees and plead for one last chance. But he knew, deep in his soul, that it was too late. Elena had already closed that chapter of her life, and he was nothing more than a regret she no longer cared to remember. Dominic let go of the fence, his hands shaking. As he turned away, a single tear slipped down his cheek. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to lose. And the worst part? He would never get another chance. Not in this lifetime. Not ever. Epilogue. The life he could never have again. Years passed like the turning pages of a forgotten book. The pain of the past had long faded for me, replaced by the warmth of a love that never wavered. I stood in the garden of our home, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Behind me, laughter echoed from inside, Daniel and our daughter, playfully bickering over bedtime stories. This was my life now. A life free from pain. A life where I was loved, cherished, respected, and somewhere, far away from this happiness, he remained lost in the ruins of his past. Dominic's perspective. Dominic sat in the dimly lit bar, his fingers tightening around the half-empty glass of whiskey. The ice had melted, the drink warm and stale, much like his existence. His life had become an endless blur of regret and alcohol, drowning in memories of her. Elena. Even now, after all these years, he still searched for traces of her in the faces of passing strangers. But she was gone. For good. He had everything once. A wife who had been willing to give him her whole heart. But he threw it away. For a woman who never truly loved him. Now, his former lover was gone, having left him the moment she realized his wealth and power were no longer enough. And he was alone. Utterly and irreversibly alone. He let out a bitter laugh, tilting his head back as the memories consumed him. The day he left Elena bleeding on the road. The day she disappeared from his life. The moment he finally understood that he had lost the only woman who had ever truly loved him. Dominic had spent years searching for her, hoping, praying for one last chance. But by the time he found her, she had already moved on. She had a new life, a new love, a family, a home, and there was no place for him in it. As he took another sip, the bartender gave him a pitying look. "You should stop drinking so much," the man said. "Whatever you're trying to forget, it's not worth it." Dominic let out a hollow chuckle. "That's the problem," he murmured. "I don't want to forget. because forgetting meant losing her all over again. And he couldn't bear that. Not when his punishment was to remember, forever. Elena's final thoughts. I walked hand in hand with Daniel, our fingers intertwined as we made our way toward the beach. The soft sound of the waves, the salty breeze, it all felt like a reminder of how far I had come. Are you happy? Daniel asked, his voice gentle. I turned to him, my heart swelling with warmth, more than I ever thought possible. He smiled, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. As we walked, a distant part of me wondered if Dominic was still searching for me, still lost in the life he had destroyed.